The Prime Minister made the comments in an interview with the Times newspaper. Now, the article opened with the sentence, "Rishi Sunak is what we can all safely call an overachiever." Look, I think broadly we can agree that if you make it into office as the Prime Minister, even without a general election, I mean, that is a hell of an achievement. Though I have to say, actually governing the country and being good at that is probably an entirely different matter. The article lists all of his academic and career successes, but then it moves on to his family life and experiences. Dear listener, I suggest that you get ready for a whole load of articles like this about all sorts of politicians in an election year. Because these kinds of interviews, let's go back to your childhood home and discover who you really are. These kinds of interviews are agreed to by top politicians, essentially because they want to be humanised for the voter in the hope that you will vote for them. Right, park that for a moment. Back to the interview itself. The Prime Minister is asked about his childhood and experience of fitting in as the child of immigrants, and he is asked about racism. He talks about how his mum particularly wanted him to fit in, and I have to say, he essentially repeats a story that I've heard a couple of times from him. He talks about how he didn't really experience racism directly growing up, but does remember one incident in a restaurant when his siblings were called the P word, which of course is a racial slur that is directed specifically at South Asians. He then says, and I think that this is touching, he says that it felt stinging and that kind of racism hurts in a way that other things don't. So this is where Mr. Sunak and I agree. Racism does sting. It cuts like a serrated knife in a way that other abuse doesn't. And I've thought a lot about why. And I suppose in the next few seconds I'm going to try and nail it. Probably won't, but let me give it a go. I think the thing about racism is it's a form of hatred that dehumanises, that reduces the victim to the pigmentation of their skin, that implies that you, the victim, is ugly, lesser, undeserving of opportunities, of respect, of equality, no matter how much you contribute to society, no matter how you treat other people. Racism is mindless, it's reductive, it's aggressive. So that's where Mr. Sunak and I agree, I think. But we part ways because the Prime Minister goes on to say that he doesn't believe his children would face the same racism that his siblings did back in the 80s. And I can evidence why the Prime Minister and I part company at this point. 2 days ago, the comedian Shapi Khorsandi, who is of Iranian heritage, tweeted about how she had been called the P word in her own neighbourhood in front of her children. She's now deleted those tweets, but I saw them in real time and I could just see the pain, read the pain. It was visceral. And the truth is, I identified very deeply with it. Let's get real here, right? Racism is more than name-calling. It can be brutal in ways that aren't physical. It can be subconscious, subtle, pernicious, upheld by systems and establishments and organisations that have not for 1 minute try to examine themselves or the impact processes, structures can have on individuals or groups of individuals. Racism can and has been stirred up and promoted by politicians. We see it now almost on a daily basis. And it's coming from the Tory party and others. But given the Conservatives are in government, it carries with it the kind of weight that some lunatic saying something mean to me on social media doesn't. Throwing red meat to voters in the form of thinly disguised bigotry and racism is utterly, utterly immoral in my view. And why do they do it? Because their poll ratings are sinking? That, to me, is the most dangerous form of racism of all. Just last week, I was talking to you, wasn't I, about that appalling, appalling slogan that the Tory party have come out with. British homes for British workers. It was talking about social housing and how the government, presumably, is some kind of weird, undeliverable manifesto pledge, is going to promise that British citizens get shot up the housing waiting lists when it comes to social housing. The fact is, it isn't even a problem. It isn't even a problem. 90% of social housing in this country goes to white UK nationals. So that's a slogan used by the National Front in the 1970s with a modern iteration trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist. So in other words, a problem is being invented, a slogan is being used, and voters are being manipulated. And the people that are going to suffer are the people who are most likely to be the most vulnerable, a minority group, because of all the horrendous rhetoric we've had day after day after day, dripping through a really rancid right-wing press that deliberately and unquestioningly reprints this rubbish. It's those people, the people at the bottom of society, that will end up getting hurt. So listen here, Mr. Sunak. You know, I'm sorry that you heard your siblings being called the P word. I'm sorry that you felt that sting, that hurt, that visceral pain. How dare you tell people that they won't experience it now? How dare you? How dare you gaslight people whose experiences you, as the country's first brown Prime Minister, something I celebrated, pretend it's not happening. And worse still, stir the pot of hatred? I feel immensely disappointed in you, Mr. Sunak. I genuinely thought it was a turning point. I did not believe in my lifetime we would see a person of colour as Prime Minister of this country. And we've got that. And I have never, ever suggested that someone's colour or racial background or faith or religion should dictate their politics. No way, because that in of itself is discriminatory. But I do think that if you are of a minority group, you do have a responsibility to understand how certain policies that you might well be promoting might disproportionately affect people from that same group or who just look like you. And for ages, genuinely for ages, I thought, he seems like a kind of nerdy academic guy. He's, well known for getting a grip of detail. Everyone says he's very clever. Maybe he's just kind of hijacked by the far right of his party. And I make no apologies for calling it the far right, because it is. Maybe Braverman and Patel, maybe these are the people that are really pushing it. Maybe he's even backed into a corner, spending, £500,000 on a Rwanda scheme that will never work. Pushing out rhetoric, tacitly accepting it because he was forced into a corner. I don't believe it anymore. I don't believe it. Because that awful phrase that he used, that lie that went out from a Tory party account last week, that's under his watch. His watch. And I'm just... Oh God, I'm just so disappointed, Mr. Sunak. In you.